In this episode, we speak with Micah Alpern, Senior Managing Director at Teneo. Micah is part of the firm's People Advisory team, where he advises organizations and executives on culture, leadership, and talent strategy, particularly in the context of transformation and transactions. Micah brings nearly 2 decades of experience guiding Fortune 500 companies and private equity-backed businesses through complex organizational change. Before joining Teneo, he was a partner at EY, where he built a culture and leadership offering, and previously held leadership roles at Kearney and Booz Company. His work focuses on leadership development, team effectiveness, and aligning culture with business strategy to improve performance. Micah was recognized by the Consulting Report as one of the top 25 human capital consultants and leaders of 2023 and 2025. Teneo is a global advisory firm that works with CEOs and senior leaders across strategy, communications, financial advisory, risk, and organizational design to help solve complex business challenges. I am your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the Executive Chairman of Market Insight Media and Managing Partner of GrowthCap. He is the host of Top Consultant, a podcast featuring today's best consultants who advise and provide services to corporations, governments, nonprofits, and other organizations. Executives and key decision makers tune in to Top Consultant to identify the most knowledgeable and experienced consultants for their most important projects.
Micah, thanks so much for taking the time. Great to be with you.
You too. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
As mentioned, this is the first time we're having Teneo on. I actually worked with someone who was at Teneo for like about 10 years, but I believe left before you got there. He ran, I think, your private placements group or private capital group, Vince Mutolo. Not sure if that name rings a bell.
Yeah.
But I remember when Teneo was kind of getting off the ground years ago, and you kind of grew very quickly. Maybe what we could do is start out with just some history and background on Teneo.
Sure. So Teneo, as you probably know, was founded in strategic communications, right? That's a big part of what we do, things around company narrative, IPOs, crisis situations. And since then, we've grown, we're a CEO advisory firm, and we've grown with, CEOs who come to us and ask, like, can you help with, our strategy? Can you help with our people challenges? So we've grown since then and added, 4 other service lines. So we have 5 total practices here. One of the biggest being strategic communications. Then we have a financial advisory business focus on debt restructuring, CFOs around that area. Then we also have a risk advisory business that, from geopolitical risk, which is a big thing right now, to cybersecurity. The other one we have is management consulting. Think of AI readiness, things of that nature. And then our practice, which is about 60 people globally, is people advisory. Within people advisory, there's board effectiveness, there's executive search, and then there's people strategy. And that's the business that I co-lead with my partner, Scott Thomas, in the Americas. And that's focused on leadership development, culture, and talent management, change management.
Mm-hmm. Culture is one of those topics that everyone loves to philosophize around and figure out, like, okay, well, how do you create a great culture that endures? It's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, maybe what we could do is spend a little time on this topic and go top down. Like, are there some basic principles that you start with?
Sure. So I've been doing this work, culture, leadership work for 20 plus years. And I learned a lot. I mean, so did my partner as well, learned a lot during our time at Booz Company, where I was part of the Katzenbach Center. He's formed by John Katzenbach, famous guru, written over 20 books on the topics. And one of the things I learned back then is, really culture is about behaviors. And I still apply that today. Culture is really, the behaviors that are exhibited across the organization. So when I think about culture, and one of the things I've learned over the years is that, a lot of people are like, it's this amorphous, touchy-feely thing. And for us and our team, it's really about, behaviors and data backed, right? If you're going to work with executives, which we do, at the C-suite level, you got to bring, real data and real behaviors when you're talking about the culture. Otherwise, they're just going to be like, yeah, that's just some touchy-feely thing I don't need to worry about. So with that, we've really thought about culture first in diagnosing it. What is the culture? And what differentiates us a little bit is in our diagnostic, we put the company's values, each individual company we work with, we put their values into our diagnostic. Because what we want to understand is how much does that culture or those values and behaviors actually exist in the current company? Are they just words on a paper or words on your internet? Or is this like really who you are and what the employees feel on a day-to-day basis? So we look at it as far as how much they experience it, how much they see leaders living those values, and how much those values are having an impact, on the performance, on the strategy, because the two have to be connected. And then we look at, defining what those values and behaviors need to be. So sometimes it's the client wants to help them strengthen the current culture and, keep the same values. And we need to strengthen those. We need to define them more clearly at a behavioral level and reinforce those behaviors. And a lot of times it's define a new culture or evolve the culture. Most of the time it's evolve the culture. And so, we'll define a set of values and behaviors. And when I say behaviors, I really mean, just to clarify for everyone listening, it's at a granular level. So when you say, collaboration, right, that's a typical value here at companies. It can't just be, work with other teams, right? Get very granular about what that behavior actually looks at. So we typically will define 3 behaviors around each value to make it clear for people. And then it's the job of each team or each leader to really define those behaviors for their team, right? Those are example behaviors. And the next piece to really make that culture real is to build a culture change program. And our team, we design it, we execute it, and it's typically around 4 areas. One being a campaign, right? A communication campaign of, that's from leadership toolkits to internet to, signs in the elevators, to, emails, videos, soup to nuts. At Teneo, one of the things we have is an internal agency. So we work closely with them. They're called Teneo Studio to build these campaigns and execute them. Second piece is around the leadership piece. One of our areas is leadership. We do executive coaching, and in those culture, we typically call it culture coaching. We create these leadership action plans, 1-page plan of like, these are the exact things that you need to do as a leader, and then we coach them through that and help to make that happen. And then sometimes as well, we'll do some training at the next level down, like VP or manager, to help those leaders as well. The third thing is around an influencer network. So when I mentioned data, one of the things we use around data is called organizational network analysis, which many people listening will know that maps the social network of the organization. And so we use that to make sure that we identify who the right influencers are across the organization, as well as make sure we reach the entire organization. Because too often leaders pick that culture champions or influencer network. They're missing huge swaths of the organization, and they also have biases. So they don't necessarily know who the real influencers are. So we use that data and we create a culture champion network or a change agent network. And we work with them to really be a 2-way feedback loop where we're pushing the information in the right behaviors, the right messaging down through the organization, and also getting feedback from them. Hey, we ran this activation. What did employees think? What do they think they'll launch? What can we be doing differently? And we're feeding that back up to the executives and taking quick action. The last thing is around the operating model. So this is really around reinforcing, the behaviors that we're asking people to live. So one of the things companies do too often is they'll say, okay, here's our new culture. Here's the behaviors we want you to live. Yet they don't change the performance management. They don't change rewards. They don't change processes. So they're saying, keep working it in the old ways, but we exhibit these new behaviors. People aren't going to do that, right? So you have to make that connection. You have to reward people for living these new behaviors. You have to assess them against the new behaviors. You have to even change processes or flatten the organization so that people live these new behaviors. The simplest way to explain it is most companies want to be more innovative, right? So that means, do you have a process for innovation to come from everywhere? No, so we need to create that. Are you assessing people whether they're coming up with new ideas or not? And are you rewarding them for coming up with new ideas? Are you tracking whether these new ideas actually go and get placed out into the market and having an impact on your performance, on your revenue, on your bottom line, right? You need to do that, as far as the metrics. I think, the last thing I would add to the reinforcement is we're really good about our team is like, we're creative. So we'll create, different activation, called like activations or interventions, a lot of people call them. And we'll try to be, creative in that. We've done like viral movements where people had these little 1-pagers that I will live this value X by doing this. And then they took a picture and posted it on LinkedIn, right? Mm-hmm. So try to create a viral movement. Or, we'll have, some sort of a Shark Tank type situation with its innovation so that the new ideas are coming. So we'll try to put, different unique and new ideas into play. So that's actually not just words on a page. It's actually, these are the behaviors and we want to see people exhibiting them.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever found that in some cases, there could be an individual or a few individuals that really hinder the ability of the organization to progress or to evolve because of these just traits that it's just hard for them to change.
Mhm.
And so you have to take action on that and say, like, okay, we need to either try to have this person like a direct intervention, like, hey, we need you to adjust how you operate, or they need to get kind of removed from the group or from the entire company. Have you had situations like that?
Sure. Yeah. I've seen that throughout my career. One of the unique things we do in our network analysis is that we overlay it with their engagement score. So we always have like one independent variable, which is basically like the question is around, would you recommend this place is a great place to work or so, that type of question. And so we overlay that onto our network map. We're able to identify not only the influencers, but the positive and negative influencers. Right. And so sometimes, some of the biggest influencers can be negative, some of the biggest negative. So there's two different tactics you can take there, to your point. One is like we go after them first and like really get them to buy in and work with them one-on-one, or have some workshops with some of those negative influencers to shift their view, to explain like how this new direction or these exhibiting these new behaviors will really support a better employee experience and also help the company to be more successful. Because if you're able to turn one of them into a positive influencer, it's going to be even more impactful than taking someone who's already positive, because they're going to shift so many people. And I've seen that work, a company where we did this overlay and we had this influencer network. It was a company that had 15 different companies, is PE back, put together. So they really didn't have a singular culture. And when we measured it, only about 40% of the people felt they had a culture. And we came back a year later after doing all the things that I mentioned to you, real focus on that influencer network. And we saw 2/3 of the company, so 67%, felt that the new culture had already taken hold 1 year later. And I think a lot of it had to do with helping to shift those people who were negative influencers, and showing them by being part of that influencer network, they could really make an impact. I mean, we had sessions where the CHRO would be like, hey, we need you to jump in on the call. And she would jump in and answer their questions. And that direct connection and seeing action happen in real time really moved the needle on their view. So I think that's one piece. The other is, I don't know if it's removing them from the company. That's not really my place to say, but moving them, to your point, into a different role or a different position. And I've seen that before as well, where we had this digital transformation I was helping to lead, and we were trying to change the culture, right, to be, more, test and learn, more experimental, more innovative. And the people leading this project they weren't really connected, and they weren't really the positive, influencers that we're saying. So basically by shifting them into a different role and bringing new people, positive influencers in to lead that, the project took off. It had barely moved for 6 months, and it just became a rocket ship, and everything started to move. And those people that we moved out, they didn't leave the organization, but, as the momentum happened with the project moving forward, and even though they weren't leaders, they jumped on board. So sometimes it is shifting those people, other times it's moving them into different roles.
How much of your work also deals with hiring the right people and understanding kind of what to look for in their history to understand whether or not they are going to be a good fit with the culture?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the other piece of our work is around leadership development. So in that, we do 360 assessments like a lot of organizations. We have our own list of capabilities focused on leading the people, leading the business, and leading for the future. And then we also do executive coaching, and we build and deliver bespoke, customized leadership development programs. So that's all involved in what we do. And, I also mentioned people advisory. We have, a whole group, 80% or 70% of our team is focused on executive search, and placement. And so we work in partnership with them in doing these 360 assessments to understand what is this person's strengths. And sometimes it's someone already in the role, and sometimes we're assessing people to potentially take on a new role. So we're assessing their strengths, their development opportunities, and coming out of that 360 assessment, when we bring a capability backed approach, then we also have the psychometrics, and we'll do a set of interviews as well to really understand the person. But coming out of that, we create a scorecard that's not only tied to their outcomes of the assessment, but the role. And we're looking at, in their strengths and development areas, will they be a fit? Can they deliver on this scorecard? If they can, what are the actions they need to take, both, in doubling down on their strengths, leveraging them, and then also in their growth and development. So we'll create that scorecard, and that'll be part of our, executive coaching, if we continue to coach them, and, delivering on that scorecard. So we're looking at both, like, are they a fit for that role? if they are, how do we help them develop into that role? Because sometimes it's, someone that's moving into a CFO or a CEO. It's like their first time. So then those people typically need a coach. Others, it's, I've been a CFO, but I'm joining a new company and I'm going to the CFO of that role. So how can I be successful in that role? So we look at both, the strengths and development. And then, like I said, the scorecard is based on not just fit, but what do they have to deliver? Is it, I'm going to have to do a lot of acquisitions. So does that person have the background? Do they have the temperament? Do they have the skills? Is it, I have to, grow a huge team that, hasn't had a great leader in the past and they need someone that can really help them grow and develop them. So it really depends on the situation.
Mm-hmm. Is there one general history where you could say like this person is going to be good? Meaning like if you see that someone is the type to stick around in an organization, they regularly get promotions, maybe they've done it 2 or 3 times over with different organizations. Are there general things you witness where you could say this is going to be a top performer for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to give you the consultant answer, but I'll go into more detail, but it depends, right? I do think having a couple of things that we look at, it's around those capabilities. As I said, we have that structure of leads to people, leads to business, leads for the future. We have 8 capabilities surrounding that framework. So if there's certain capabilities that are needed more for a role, we'll look at how strong they are on that versus others. So I think that's one. First, do they have the capabilities needed to be, a leader or executive? Second is the point you're making, a track record of success. So to give you a real life example, we're assessing a potential CEO to take on a role for a PE firm, one of their portcos. They're looking for a new CEO. And we talked to them about what needed to be in the scorecard. And, one thing is, thinking about their AI strategy, which is not surprising in today's day, right? Experience in that particular industry or in that field. And the third thing that stood up is kind of to your point is, had they built up a company that had been sold and worked at PE, had that PE background, that history. And so when we were assessing the one leader that we recommended, I remember asking him about his view of like AI strategy. He literally had a whiteboard behind him. He's like, oh, I've already been thinking that out. Let me talk you through that. And so, he had the background to think about like, how can I grow this company into the future? And then also he did have that track record of he had led, 1 or 2 other portcos that had, moved through the, the realization process. He'd been able to, to build value creation for companies in the past. And then we were looking and we looked at his capabilities. One of the things is the management team was a mix of positive and negative as far as strengths, and he was going to have to switch some of that out. So we were looking at his capabilities, being able to grow and develop people, to inspire, an organization, and he really spiked on those because those were the most important capabilities. Coming into a portco that had been founder led, and now it's going to be a new CEO. Like, could you encapsulate where we want to go as an organization and excite people who had always been following this founder in this role? And so we try to look at those, to my point about the capabilities, like the spikes that we needed this person to have around those 8 capabilities.
I'm curious to get your thoughts around remote, hybrid, in person, and how that plays into the development or maintenance of a strong culture.
Sure. I'll give my personal approach, and then I'll give you the company, is that if my team and the people I work with get their work done, I really don't care where they're working. Right. So that's my personal approach. I work remote, I work from home, but when I need to be with clients, I go to the clients. So I do think there's a lot of value of being in person, and I don't think any company needs to be fully remote. I know it works for some, depending on, like it's a call center or something. I get that. But I do think there's a lot of value in bringing people together because it's hard to build relationships and to build that camaraderie, especially for a leadership team. You need to be really aligned and have a deep understanding of like, what's the strengths that RJ brings, versus John or Scott or Diane, right? So I do think there's value in that. To build culture, to your original question, you can build culture in both ways, whether it's hybrid or in person, but you have to be very intentional and deliberate of the actions you take. And so when I see companies that are asking employees to come back, I always tell them when I've talked to them about it, is like, if you're asking them to come back, you have to give them reasons of why they're coming back. And then you have to make it different when they come back. A real intentionality of, okay, we want you to come back because we want you to work more closely together. Okay, when they're back in the office, are they all just sitting at their cubes on video calls? Or are you having them go out into breakout rooms, into workshops, and really, solving problems and collaborating together? Because if you're doing the latter, then they're going to be like, oh yeah, I get why I'm coming back to the office. So we're doing these sessions that we weren't doing before that we couldn't do remotely, because I can tell you when my team gets together all in a room and we're whiteboarding, by the end of the day, we're like, oh my God, we got so much more done than we did when we were remote. So I do think you need to be very intentional and deliberate. And then when it comes to if you are hybrid, you have to make sure that you are making the people who are remote feel just as included as the people who are in person. And I'll give you an example that we were helping a company launch their new values. So we did a diagnostic, understanding like what the values should be and where we need to double down to build these values up. And we had this big launch, and they have a headquarters in Tennessee, and there was probably like 900 people in person and probably about 900 people who are remote on video. And so what we did is after the CEO and the CHRO explained the culture and what it would look like and how it would feel, we had an exercise. And in the room, each person, they had this glass with like a nice chopsticks with the 4 values on it, but there's a piece of paper in it that they were going to write on, and they would turn to their partner, talk about like, pick one of the values and talk about like how you're going to live that personally. Like what is one thing you'll do? And they would write on this piece of paper. And then outside of there, we had these installations set up, and they were going to create these chain links, symbolic chain links of all these behaviors. So that's what we were doing in person. But like I said, we had 900 people on the phone virtually. So in that, we did a breakout with them where we brought in a visual artist, and my colleague and I led this, Callie, where we asked them, and we had live polling of like, what does this value mean to you? So we did like 2 values in each of the different launch calls. And they, put in like 1 word or 2 to 3 words of what it meant to them and what it would look like. And then we had a visual artist live on the call building out, creating this visual of the value. And then when we came back, that was like a 15-minute exercise inside and virtually. And we came back to the room, and, the CHRO went around the room. It's like, what are some of the conversations you were having in the room around these values that people shared? And then she passed it over to me, and she said, tell me what you're hearing on the call. And we put up the visual because the artist made it live right there in those 15 minutes. And then I kind of talked through like what the visual was showing. And then that created, these 4 different slides or 4 different visuals of each of the values. And that's put up on the internet, in the elevators across the organization. So see, in that example, the people who are virtual felt like they were in the room and part of it. When we asked for feedback, the survey post-launch, all these people were saying like, we never done anything like that. I really appreciate that you made us feel part of the organization, part of the launch, even though we weren't there. So that's what I mean by when I say intentional. You have to like really make sure people don't feel excluded. You got to create this inclusive environment. So no matter where you work, you're part of the organization.
I'd like to switch gears for a second because we like to find out more about you, the consultant and leader. Tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up? And then you kind of went through different top consulting firms. So let's start with where you started out.
Yeah, so I grew up in Florida, born and raised in Florida. One of the few people who just moved here, a place called Port Charlotte on the west coast of Florida. My dad was an orthodontist and my mom was a dental hygienist, and they worked together. They ran their office together. And from there, I went to Northwestern, ended up in Chicago. It's funny because I'd never even seen snow until I went to college. And then I was in Chicago for 15 years throughout my career. I had a little stop in DC for a few years, and I went to University of Florida for grad school. And then I actually came back to Florida as a COVID mover about 6 years ago. So that's kind of my life journey, not my career journey. And I have a 12-year-old daughter who's born in Chicago. And now is a Floridian like me, but she misses city life. Still likes to tell people she's a Chicagoan. As far as my career, so yeah, to your point, I started off at Accenture, doing kind of the system implementation consulting. And I quickly learned that's not really what I wanted to do. I wanted to, more focus on the people side. We were doing, some change management, but I just felt we weren't really doing it in the way that I felt was effective. It was just training and communication. And I was like, nobody's changing because that's all we're doing. So from there, I went over to Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was at Booz Allen Hamilton and Booz and Company for about 8 years of my career. So for those that most know, but they split into 2 separate companies, one being the government consulting and one being the corporate consulting. And so what's interesting is that I started out in the government consulting because as I mentioned, I lived in DC for a few years. And then I got a chance to do an actual, company project, and I loved it. It was much more fast paced. And I came back and I was like, that's all I want to do. Mm-hmm. And I want to leave DC and move to Chicago. At that point, they weren't really letting people, now you can live anywhere, but they weren't letting people really transfer. So I actually left Booz Allen for like about a year and a half. And then I rejoined because I went somewhere else, and I rejoined Booz and Company. And then I was doing the commercial. And then, as I said, as I joined Booz and Company, that's right when they acquired the Katzenbach partners. So I was became part of the Katzenbach Center. And that's really, really fell in love with the work I do now, which is around culture and leadership. I got to do this really cool global study. That was one of my first projects around culture and change. And we got all this data back and really learned about like how you really drive culture change, wrote a couple papers on it. Then I was hooked. And that's like all the work I wanted to do from then on. I worked with all kinds of different companies from Walgreens to Toyota to Philips Healthcare, to financial services companies. So really worked with some of the greatest companies in the world. And what happened was Booz was acquired. It changed a bit. And so that's why at that point I decided to leave. And there's another Katz partner who I really looked up to at A.T. Kearney. So I went over and joined him. And then he actually left a little bit after I joined, unfortunately, left to go into the PE world. And that's where I learned about these talent operating partners within the PE world. And that those are, people I could work with and help drive change even faster. And so from then on, my goal was I wanted to work in PE and Fortune 500. And that's really what brought me to Teneo, is that the opportunity. And that's what I do. It's like probably 60-40 PE portcos across the portfolio and still Fortune 500 companies like Coca-Cola, ServiceNow, and companies like that. But I work a lot with the PE firms as well. And I think I love this work because I really get a lot of fulfillment in the idea that if you change a culture, you can impact, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and employees. To me, that's not a better consulting type job than that, to be able to impact so many people. And also by, helping a leader grow and develop, that impacts even more people, right? So that's kind of where I fell in love with this work. And beyond the work, it's a passion of mine. So I've written, 25 plus articles on the topic. And I've always wanted to do that because as I mentioned, my dad was an orthodontist, but he was also an inventor and a thought leader. So he wrote 2 textbooks. He wrote, hundreds of articles. I don't think I've caught him yet. And so, in following his lead and wanting to be like him, I continued to do the same.
Last 2 questions. I think you might have answered the first one. Can you tell us about a person who's had a profound influence on you?
Yes, I kind of did my dad. My dad was, it's funny to say, but like a famous orthodontist, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's funny to say a famous orthodontist, but yeah, he lectured all over the world. He had like 14 patents. He wrote in all kinds of different articles. I think he was the first orthodontist ever to do a TMJ surgery with an orthopedic surgeon, and they published lots of literature on that. And I just remember as a kid, I'd go to these conferences where my dad, orthodontic conferences, really interesting for a kid. But I just remember my dad being up on stage and hundreds of people in the room and they're like hanging on every word as he talked about teeth and in the jaw. And I just, I looked up to him and wanted to be like him because of that.
Last question. Can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
I spend a lot of time working. And then when I'm not working, I'm with my daughter and we do a lot. We spend a lot of time together doing she's really into pickleball and tennis. And there's not much free time I have, to be honest, outside of that. We do a lot of things here with our school. We'll do plant trees or, pick up trash on the beach here in Florida. So I don't know if there's one that I'm passionate about, but, I kind of just volunteer and do things wherever I can. But mostly it's with my daughter.
Excellent. Micah, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a great conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.